To God be the glory.
Welcome back to our study, Evidence for Christianity. Having looked at a variety of powerful arguments for God's existence and the Bible's inspiration, we must now consider the central theme of the Bible's message: Jesus, His life and role as the prophesied Messiah. In this class, we will look at the first issue, the life of Jesus, and address the foundational question, did He really live and walk this earth as a man? If Jesus was a real person, and one that has become so well known across the world and through history, then we would expect to find evidence of His physical existence. So let's do some investigation of ancient history to see what evidence there is. And as we begin, let's look at some of the statements for our argument. All right? Jesus' deity. Jesus lived and taught and influenced the world. His life and death fulfilled messianic prophecies. So just practically thinking, He lived. His teachings were an influence that we can see the result of. But then on top of that, His life and His death fulfilled prophecy. If we put it in a little bit more formal language, premise number one, if Jesus' historical nature and fulfillment of messianic prophecy can be proved, then Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ. The assertion, premise number two, historical evidence does exist, and fulfillment of prophecy is beyond mere coincidence, and therefore, the conclusion, Jesus was truly the Christ. All right, so right there, premise number two, we have the assertion that historical evidence does exist, and that's what we're going to focus on in this particular class. We're going to consider the historical nature from the secular sources that point to Jesus. We're going to first look at historian's perspective, a modern historian's perspective. Number two, we will look at hostile witnesses, those that were not Christians. They were in some sort of other context, whether antagonistic or some periphery looking at Christianity. And then number three, we'll look at some friendly witnesses to Jesus' character. You might think about the aspect of a courtroom in which witnesses are asked to come in. They are asked to give their testimony, their eyewitness account, or their understanding of the facts. And so we might consider this sort of a court case where we are bringing in witnesses to ask them about Jesus, with the focus of Jesus' historical nature, all right? Not necessarily asking much beyond that. What was He the Christ? Do you see Him as the Messiah? Do you like His teachings? But instead, tell us about the man so that we can understand that He truly lived and walked. I want to first share a quote with you by a historian, a 20th century historian, Will Durant. He wrote a series, and in that series he had a book called Caesar and Christ. Here is what he said. In the enthusiasm of its discoveries, the higher criticism has applied to the New Testament tests of authenticity so severe that by them 100 ancient worthies, example, Hammurabi, David, Socrates, would fade into legend. What did Will Durant mean by this? When he talked about the higher criticisms, okay, he is speaking about the analysis, the evaluation, the critiquing that the New Testament has had applied to it. But look at what he says. He says, whether you're critiquing it for positive aspects or because you're skeptical and want to find holes in it, either way, the New Testament has gone through so much evaluation that if you took that same level and depth and breadth of evaluation and you applied it to Hammurabi, he'd fade away. He'd go away. If you applied it to David Or if you applied it to Socrates, they would just become legends because of how severe and how critical that evaluation has been. He goes further and talks about the context. He says, the revolution that Jesus sought was a far deeper one. If he could cleanse the human heart of selfish desire, cruelty, and lust, all those institutions that rise out of human greed and violence, and the consequent need for law would disappear. Christ was, in this spiritual sense, the greatest revolutionist in history. Will Durant, looking at the intention of the message and how far-reaching that impact was. Okay, now let's turn and look and think to ancient history, looking at those who we might categorize as hostile witnesses, all right? So in a courtroom, they are not favorable to the defense, right? They are the prosecution, maybe. They are those that are not from Christianity. We're going to look at Flavius Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Lucian. All right, let's start with Flavius Josephus. Often he's referenced simply as Josephus, a Jewish historian. But for the full context, it's important to note the full name, Flavius Josephus, as this shows the context in which his writing was more well known. His works, Jewish Wars and Antiquity of the Jews, being commissioned under Roman approval. While in his early life, Josephus served as a military leader. He was ultimately captured and kept in service by both Vespasian and Titus, Roman rulers. Some have claimed that he was a traitor to the Jewish people. Still others hold that his historical writings are some of the best sources outside of the Bible for understanding the life and times of the Roman world, specifically in Judea. What did Josephus say? Did he talk about Christianity? Did he talk about Jesus? In his work, Antiquities of the Jews, here is something that he said. He said, "So he, Ananus, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." What did Josephus talk about? Well, he talked about the context of his day, talked about that there was a man named James. This man, James, was the brother of Jesus. Okay? He ultimately says that James was accused of this crime and that he was essentially delivered to be stoned. But in the middle there, he referenced Jesus, and he referenced a qualifier who was called Christ. Okay, so it's not just any Hebrew Yeshua. It wasn't just anybody who went by the name of Yeshu or Jesus in the English translation of it. It's not just any man. He ties it specifically to a man who some referred to as being the Messiah, the Christ. And yes, this man had a brother named James. Here's the context. So we ask the question, Josephus, was Jesus a real person? Well, according to what he just said, absolutely, because he had a brother named James, and James was ultimately stoned. Now, there's another passage in that same work, Antiquities of the Jews. This passage has a little bit more debate and controversy that surrounds it, but we'll talk about it in a moment. All right, here is what it says. "And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal man amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day." We can see in this passage where Josephus talks about Jesus. He talks about that there was this person who was brought forward and that he was condemned. And, while there are some positive statements about Jesus or in some reference, we can set them aside to begin to understand just a historical nature. All right. Now, some of that was the conclusion of some of the aspects of what happened. When he talked about that there was a tribe of Christians, there were those that followed after this person, who named themselves after it, and how they claimed and talked about that he loved them, he did not forsake them. But let's listen to the context that just precedes it. He says, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. He was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And then it goes into when Pilate had him. So in this passage, it does have some positive statements, right? Talks about Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him that. He did wonderful works. It mentions that he was the Christ. It mentions that he rose from the dead. All right, so these passages that have a positive aspect. Sometimes the controversy is brought up that Josephus's works were potentially corrupted. That in these works, Christians or those looking at Christianity in a positive light inserted phrases that made it sound better. All right. That's unlikely in terms of the textual criticism of Josephus, but let's stop for a moment and say, even if that's the case, we have a full context that mentions Jesus by name. If we take out the positive accolades that are brought in favor, it talks about teaching. Okay, that's what he did. It talks about him impacting both Jews and Gentiles. And notice it says he drew over to him, all right, as if they were being drawn away from some place, Jews being drawn away from Judaism. It goes on to mention Pilate. It goes on to mention the aspect of a trial and accusations. Okay, so in the full context, even if you take out all the positive descriptions and adjectives, what do we still have? Well, we still have Josephus conveying a historical event involving multiple people and drawing from that the fact that his audience needs to know about this context, but may also be familiar. You see, Josephus lived in the first century. He was a contemporary of Jesus and the apostles. It's possible that he had heard stories about Christianity, what it said, what it meant, how it drew people away from Judaism, and was meant to be a fulfillment of old law and a change and a new covenant. So he was familiar with this, and so in his writings of history at a later time, he is recording and documenting the fact that his readers need to know about these elements. And so we ask Josephus again, based on that quote, based on what we have, did Jesus simply live? Yes. All right, now if we turn to a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus. You know, Tacitus is often referred to as the father of modern history. All right? His historical writings and serving as a historian kind of set the groundwork in history as far as something to emulate, a way and a process and a behavior, a way to approach things. And so in Tacitus, he speaks mainly of Roman history, the various rulers, the things that were happening within the empire. But in a work called the Annals, here is something that Tacitus says. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. In this initial section of Tacitus's writings, he's talking about, right, an aspect that happened during the time of Nero, where Nero is torturing those who call themselves Christians. And he relates that. He brings it together and says that the word Christians, maybe the Roman audience, the secular audience that he was writing to, may not fully understand what that term is. Maybe they've come across it, but maybe not. Again, he's writing there at the end of the first century, the very beginning of the second century. So here he references the Christians. They're called that in general. Their leader, from whom the name derives, Christus. Okay, now that looks a little different than Jesus or Messiah, but it looks an awful lot like Christ. It's the Latin form of Christ. Christ being from Greek, Christus being Latin. And so Tacitus is talking about the scenario that Christians are found in during the time of Nero, tortures that were happening. I want to go on and read a little bit more from this exact passage and take a look at what it continues on, because it will give to us a perspective of Christ and the Christians, but also where they found themselves at that time, into the first century, beginning of the second. All right, so he goes on to say, "And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, doomed to the flames, and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus." Here in this context, we find in full the description of Christians living and operating under their faith, calling themselves after Christ, a man who lived, who they follow after. But then we see that it's described as this mischievous superstition, right? That it was not looked upon favorably. The torture that happened to them when they would not recant or change or put away their Christianity. And then they were used in this brutal endeavor as a spectacle. Tacitus calls it a circus of Nero. He goes on and he finishes in this quote, and he says, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, which he's placing that on Christians, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. You see, it was so severe at that time that even the population realized this isn't right. This is wrong. Something is wrong. But again, we bring Tacitus to the stand, the witness stand, and we ask Tacitus, were there really a group called Christians? Yes, that's what I said. Was there really a leader of them who lived? Christ. Yes, that's who they called themselves after. And they followed so loyally, so devotedly that they were brutally tortured and murdered in such a way that people began to take pity for what was happening to them. All right, now let's move a little bit more forward in time. A contemporary of Tacitus, a historian, but also a governor. Pliny the Younger was a governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor. Very interestingly, we have contents of letters that Pliny the Younger wrote to the Roman Emperor Trajan. And specifically, he had letters that regarded how to deal with Christians, their religion. How do you deal with it? And how do you deal with the fact that they are faithful in adhering to it? So in his in his passage of letters to the Emperor Trajan, we find this letter. It is my custom, sir, to refer to you in all cases where I do not feel sure. For who can better direct my doubts or inform my ignorance? I have never been present at any legal examination of the Christians, and I do not know, therefore, what are the usual penalties passed upon them, or the limits of those penalties, or how searching an inquiry should be made. We think about what Pliny is writing. It sounds like he's using some very familiar language, all right? So this is not the first letter or first correspondence, and we'll see later that Trajan and Pliny were well acquainted and had a good relationship. Pliny reaches out and says, what do you do with Christians? It seems like, under other legal trials and examinations I've heard about, but I haven't been a part of, but apparently this is a growing issue in his mind within his region. He goes on and he says, I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, and I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment, if they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed. So he brought them in and looked to see if they would recant. He continues in the same letter, others who were named by that informer, all right, so bringing somebody in, but they do recant, and they inform. He says, at first, confessed themselves to be Christians, the others that were brought in, and then denied it. They all worshiped your statue and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. So there we have a reference not just to the group of Christians, a religious sect in Pliny's mind, but he then relates it. The fact that they are recanting, they are changing their worship to worship images of Trajan and the Roman gods as opposed to worshiping Christ. And so he says, at the pain of death, at the threat of death, there were some who gave up Christ, a worship of this man, and they turned and worshiped gods and Trajan's statue. All right? So in a Roman mind, to them, they were just changing allegiance. Instead of worshiping one physical man, they're now supposed to be worshiping a different physical man. He goes on and he talks about kind of what they did. He said, they affirmed, those that changed, they did affirm, however, the whole of their guilt or their error. And this is what they said, that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light. And when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and they bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds. All right, so when Pliny examined them, those on threat of death who did give up their Christian belief, what did they say was part of their guilt was that their worship involved hymns and singing, looking to Jesus as a God, and to give themselves to do righteous things and not wicked things. All right. Here is Trajan's reply back to Pliny. He says, you have adopted the proper course, my dear Pliny, in examining into the cases of those who have been denounced to you as Christians. For no hard and fast rule can be laid down to meet a question of such wide extent. The Christians are not to be hunted out. Okay, so Trajan, in response to how do you deal with Christians? He says, you've done a good thing, a reasonable course. You bring them in, you ask them, you see about them denouncing, but then he says it's hard to lay down a simple rule because of the extent. That's an interesting thought of how wide at this point in time it is recognized. And he says Christians are not to be hunted out, but of course, if you find them and they're denounced and they are found guilty or they don't denounce Christ, then you carry out punishment. All right, so we bring both Pliny the Younger and Trajan, and we ask them, was there a man named Jesus? Was he the Christ, or looked at by some as the Christ? And they would answer yes. All right, now if we turn to Suetonius, very interestingly, these three, Pliny the Younger, Trajan, and Suetonius, are all contemporaries. Suetonius was a Roman historian who was a friend of Pliny the Younger. Actually, Pliny would describe Suetonius as a man of the highest integrity, probity, and learning. He also would write to Trajan asking for a special favor to be granted to Suetonius for being childless, some sort of special favor in their culture at that time that would be bestowed on Suetonius by Trajan. And Pliny documented in his letter Trajan's reply immediately before the letter talking about Christians. He wrote a response and granted the favor. So very interesting. These three men had nothing to do with Christianity other than they were having to prosecute it, having to deal with it, trying to understand its context within their life. But here is something that Suetonius said. Suetonius, in writing about the life of Claudius, he would say, he, that is Claudius, restored to the Senate the provinces of Achaia and Macedonia, which Tiberius had taken into his own charge. He deprived the Lycians of their independence, restored theirs to the Rhodians. He allowed the people of Ilium perpetual exemption from tribute. And then notice this. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, speaking of Claudius, expelled them from Rome. So in this full discussion about Claudius and the great things that he had done in his rule following after Tiberius, he goes through and references several groups and people and real occurrences, historical activities, and then he says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Most scholars believe that Chrestus reference right there is to Jesus, that it's just sort of a misspelling of Christus, which we saw previously in Tacitus's writing, right? So because of the Jews and the Christians having these disturbances, the Christians were expelled from Rome. He goes on and says, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. He writes this in the Lives of the Caesars, talking about Nero. All right, so Suetonius, we bring you before the witness stand, and we ask, did Jesus live? Well, absolutely, because Claudius had to deal with those that followed him, listened to his teaching, right? And so here was this context in their life. It was mischievous. It was a superstition. It was a hassle. They had to clear them out. But what we get is absolutely they existed. All right. One of our last hostile witnesses, Lucian, all right, writing in the early 2nd century. Here's what he said. The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. He goes on and says, you see these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. Notice what Lucian says. He ascribes Christians, but again, this group is worshiping, in his viewpoint, a singular man. To this day, he says. And this man introduced, what does he say? He says novel rites. Okay, so this is something that is new, a pattern of action and worship and behavior that was not seen in other religions, especially the Roman religions. All right, so Lucian, we bring you into court and put you in the witness stand. Are there Christians? Yes. Do they worship a man? Yes. And that man being Jesus, who they get the name from. All right, here is our last hostile witness. And it happens much later after the 1st and 2nd century. There is a Jewish writing, the Babylonian Talmud, sometimes also called the Gemara. All right, so in the 6th century AD, All right, so several hundreds of years later. The Talmud's a Jewish document that brings together the Mishnah, okay, writings on the oral Torah, and the Gemara, commentaries about the Mishnah. All right, so these were developed over a long period from the 1st century all the way to the 7th century. One of the most well-documented Talmud works is the Babylonian Talmud. And in it, here is a passage in the Sanhedrin 43a section. It says, "On Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene, after they had killed him by way of stoning. And a crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming, 'Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray.'" First off, is this something that is beneficial? Is it positive towards Christianity? Absolutely not. All right? It refers to several details, okay? And while the details in this much later work do have conflict in some of the specific nature, right? It talks about Jesus being stoned, although it does reference crucifixion. The intent, though, is to show that the earliest hostile references, they weren't trying to claim that Jesus didn't exist at all, that he was non-existent, that he was just a myth, a historical figure. Instead, hundreds of years later, having to write and deal with the fact that Christianity was still around, that it was still this plague or scourge on Judaism, they wrote to impugn his character and his message, not his existence and his nature. All right, so we find that in these hostile witnesses, they all referenced Jesus and Christ and Christians as real and historical and sometimes causing problems, they thought. Sometimes doing things that were strange, novel, singing, committing themselves to righteousness. All right. Now, if we look at our last grouping, our last evidence, number 3, friendly witnesses. All right, friendly witnesses. Now, we won't necessarily detail some of the quotes, although the quotes are wonderful and very insightful to understand the context of those who would claim Jesus as the Messiah in those early centuries. But I just want to present their names to you. Clement of Rome was a contemporary in the 1st century. Ignatius, also contemporary in the 1st century. Polycarp, 1st century. Justin Martyr, beginning the 2nd century, and then Irenaeus, also in the 2nd century. All right, so here are 5 names of those who would claim themselves as Christian and who would speak about and talk about and quote from passages within Scripture, but also referencing historical events and accounts. All of these individuals, too, are hardly discussed in terms of their existence or not. Historians, sure, yes, Clement of Rome lived and wrote, and here's these works, and sure, Polycarp, yeah, he was a real person, walked the earth, and yes, he wrote some things. Of course, we're not asking, do you believe what they wrote, or do you believe what Jesus said? Right now, we just want to ask the question of his life. So as we conclude our class today, the life of Jesus has taken on so much impact and influence on the world because of the Bible's account and the recognition of its inspiration. The evidence for the Bible's inspiration provides an enormous weight to the question, did Jesus truly live and walk this earth? The manuscript evidence for the Bible says yes. The hostile witnesses against the Bible and Christianity, they also say yes. All right. Thank you for joining us in this class, and I hope that you will come back and join us as we dive into more evidences now for the deity of Christ.